Okay, we are going to talk about the U-2 overflights and the capture of Francis Gary Powers today. This was a tough situation between the Soviet Union and the United States, which led to some real relationship problems that were going to the 1960s. And what happened is on May 1st of 1960, the pilot of an American U-2 spy plane was shot down while flying through Soviet airspace. That pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured alive by the Soviets, but they did not disclose that until a later date. When the United States was confronted about that spy flight over Russian soil, the United States claimed that the U-2 plane that was shot down had been conducting a routine weather flight. Now keep in mind that they don't know whether the pilot, they being the United States, know whether the pilot is dead or alive. Well, the United States continued to explain that routine weather flight by saying that there had been a malfunction of the oxygen delivery system in the plane, which meant that the pilot, Gary Powers, did not receive the sufficient oxygen, and so he blacked out and drifted over Soviet airspace. Well, that story really didn't hold much with the Soviet Union, especially on May 7th, 1960, when the Soviet Union disclosed that they had captured Gary Powers, the pilot, and he had survived. Well, it became very clear that day that Powers had not blacked out, as American officials had stated, and because of the basic lie that was told by the American government to the Soviets, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who is on your ID sheet, we'll talk a lot about him in the future, was now forced, he forced President Eisenhower's hand. So finally on May 11th of 1960, President Eisenhower finally acknowledged his full awareness of not only Gary Powers' spy flight, but also the entire spy program that was put into place by the United States. But he was not apologetic. He continued to state publicly, not only did he know about the spy flight of Powers and the spy flight program the United States was conducting, he said that these American spy flights were necessary in maintaining national defense, and that as President of the United States, he planned to authorize and continue these flights. Well, that did not make Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union very happy, so he demanded that President Eisenhower apologize for the flight and also promise him that they would discontinue any more American flights over Soviet airspace. Well, President Eisenhower refused to apologize. He also refused to discontinue the flights, and this led to some poor relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. For example, at the time this occurred, there was a Paris Peace Summit in Geneva in which members of the United Nations were there to talk about peace, and the Soviet delegation, when they heard about Eisenhower's response to Khrushchev on the apology, basically just walked out before the peace summit began. And what that did is it really cooled relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. It cooled them so much that Premier Khrushchev abandoned any attempt to cooperate with the Eisenhower administration, and he basically stated, that being Khrushchev, that he would take his chances with the new President of the United States that would be inaugurated in January of 1961. So what Premier Khrushchev is stating is that he would take his chances with President-elect John F. Kennedy. And it will be Kennedy's responsibility to work with the Cold War situation between the Soviet Union and the United States. Whatever happened to Francis Gary Powers, he was tried by the Soviets and convicted of spying on the Soviet Union. He was sentenced to 10 years in a Soviet prison, 7 of those of hard labor. So it was not an easy sentence. However, finally, in February of 1962, Powers was traded or exchanged back to the United States in return for a Soviet spy that the United States had captured by the name of Rudolf Abel. So again, Powers was traded for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel, and he came back to the United States after serving some time in that Soviet prison. That kind of tells you about the U-2 flight and Gary Powers, and we're going to finish the lectures with the summary of Eisenhower's administration, modern republicanism. And really, when you think about what happened during the Eisenhower administration, it was really 8 years of very little change. And many believed, especially historians, that during the 8 years that he was president, probably the two most accomplished events during his presidency was the admittance of Hawaii and Alaska into the Union. Now, some other things about President Eisenhower that really helped the Democrats ensure the presidency in 1960 is the 8 years that he was president, the Eisenhower administration could only balance the federal budget 3 times of the 8 years he was in office. And also, you remember that Eisenhower inherited from Truman the largest peacetime deficit in American history. Well, by 1959, that record that Truman had passed on to Eisenhower had upped to a new record. So in 1959, Eisenhower's administration would incur the largest peacetime deficit in American history. So that is the lecture. I am going to talk a little bit about the test tomorrow and the review. Basically what there's going to be is there are going to be 35 answers on this test. There are going to be 10 multiple choice questions that will result in answers. There will be 5 short answer questions and 20 matching. So here's what you need to know. I would know, number 1, the man who was the conservative Republicans' favorite for nomination for president in the election of 1952. I would know what the Democratic ticket was in 1952. In other words, who ran for the presidency on the Democratic side and the vice presidency in 1952. I would know the statistics concerning loss of life at the conclusion of the Korean War, as far as how many American soldiers were killed, how many North Korean soldiers were killed, and how many South Korean civilians were killed. I would know the man who assisted Dwight Eisenhower in getting his West Point appointment. He was a senator from Kansas. I would also know who President Eisenhower's top cabinet choice was according to historians. In other words, who was the best cabinet appointment that Eisenhower made. Now, remember that he had a very poor cabinet. Also would know what the minimum wage was after Eisenhower raised it during his modern republicanism campaign. I also would know other things that happened during Eisenhower's modern republicanism, like the amount of money that was spent to clear slums across the nation, as far as government loans to students that went to college and what they had to study in order to get these low-interest loans, and what happened to Social Security benefits during the Eisenhower administration. I would know who the man was that had reported progress concerning a vaccine against polio in March of 1953. I would know the man who replaced John Foster Dulles in Eisenhower's cabinet after Dulles died during Eisenhower's administration. And I would know the one man, there were several that were criticized, but who was the man that Senator Joseph McCarthy accused of communist activity that was the straw that broke the camel's back, that set the stage for the Army McCarthy hearings? There was one individual, he was Secretary of the Army, that ended up starting that entire process. I would know the significance of the Supreme Court ruling Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and really the answer to that is it desegregated public schools. I would know the 42-year-old seamstress that refused to give up her seat in the whites-only section on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama on December 1st, 1955 that led to Dr. Martin Luther King's 13-month bus boycott in that city. I would know what the nightmare of Ford Motor Company was in 1958 through 1960 and why it was a nightmare. And I would know what book Ernest Hemingway won the Pulitzer Prize for literature in 1953. From that point on, we have matching questions, and so I'm going to go through the answers, and you need to figure out who they are. I would know, first of all, who the Soviet premier was that forced President Eisenhower's hand about an American spy mission over Russia. I would know the American pilot who was shot down while flying through Soviet airspace in 1960. I would know the famous musician, other than J.P. Richardson and Buddy Holly, that was killed early in his career in February of 1959 in a plane crash in Iowa. I would know the real name of Dr. Seuss. I would know the name of the dog who traveled into space for the Soviet Union but did not return alive. I would know who hosted the famous musical television show American Bandstand for many, many years. I would know the Negro women's tennis player that won Wimbledon in July of 1957. I would know the man who quit his college track and field team over his Elvis sideburns. I would know who integrated Major League Baseball with his signing of Jackie Robinson in 1946. I would also know who won the 200 meters in the 1936 Summer Olympic Games in Berlin, right in front of Adolf Hitler. It was Jackie Robinson's brother who finished second to this guy in that particular race. I would know the presidential assistant for Eisenhower who resigned because of a scandal going into Ike's second term. I would know the governor of Arkansas who denied admission to 9 Negro students at Little Rock Central High School. I would know the local pastor in Montgomery, Alabama, who led a bus boycott for nearly 13 months in that city. I would know the Secretary of State under President Harry S. Truman that was attacked by Senator Joseph McCarthy during that communism crusade. He would later go on to become a very important person in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'd like you to know who married Senator John F. Kennedy in the wedding of the decade in 1952. Also, who the first American woman was to fly faster than the speed of sound in an airplane. The Secretary of Defense under Eisenhower who was quoted as saying, "What is good for General Motors is good for the country." I'd like you to also know who the successful Secretary of Agriculture was under President Eisenhower. I also would like to know the name of the book that was written by President Eisenhower during the time he served as president of Columbia University. And finally, I want you to know the name of the man who ran successfully on the Republican ticket for the vice presidency in both 1952 and 1956. The test will have 35 answers. They'll be worth 4 points apiece. The test tomorrow is 140 points, and we will meet in the Commons 4th period tomorrow to take the exam. Okay? Those are the notes. Those are the review. If you have any questions, especially those kids that were gone to student council, you just give me a text or a call and I'll try to answer them for you.